Oh, just look at that wintry scene. Seems like a dreamy way to camp in frigid temperatures. And it is.
But like that accent, beautiful things can be deceiving. Hot tent camping in the backcountry is beautiful, but it's also a lot of effort, especially alone, and when you're starting out there can be some frustrations. Imagine yourself sitting on the cold ground in a sagging tent with the stove smoking you out as you try to melt snow for a measly gulp of water while creosote drips onto your new tent. That could have someone wishing they never bought the thing, and I've been there. Even if things go as planned, with limited daylight hours, you've got to find a way to haul in a huge load, set up the hot tent and stove securely, process lots of firewood, get a good supply of water, make meals, and when all that's done, you can collapse into bed and either sleep in the cold or wake up to keep the stove going all night. Some people tell me it looks like way too much work, but I'll tell you I think it's the greatest way to spend a long winter. In this video, I'll share what I've learned about winter camping in a hot tent, and I'm not saying this is the way to do it, it's just one way. I'm not an expert, but I've spent a lot of time in a hot tent, so if you're relatively new to it, this video could save you years of growing pains. And if this isn't your first rodeo, hopefully you'll sift out a couple of nuggets. There are chapters in the playback bar if you want to pick and choose topics. Let's start with the haul in, assuming you're on foot. Hot tents and stoves are pretty heavy items for most campers, usually way too heavy for backpacking. Here I'm hauling in on a 9-foot freight toboggan, but I've also used Pulks and a Smitty sled. All three of these options can carry a solid amount of gear, so I boil this choice down to two variables, flotation and friction. Flotation deals with how much surface area is in contact with the snow. The more there is, the lesser your load will sink. It's the same effect you get with snowshoes. However, more surface area can also mean more friction and less glide. A Pulk is cheap and widely available, offers good flotation, it's very easy to pack, but under a heavy load, it doesn't glide as well as the other options. You can add some polyethylene runners onto a Pulk and that helps a bit, or you can create a 2-Pulk train which improves flotation by distributing your load. Then there's a Smitty sled, which is some sort of frame that sits on skis. I consider this an upgrade from a Pulk because the skis greatly reduce friction. However, now your load is sitting on less surface area, which can be an issue in deep snow with a heavy load. If you expect to use it in deep snow, you may want to make a Smitty sled with snowboards instead of skis to maximize float. A freight toboggan offers probably the most flotation and least friction for a heavy load, but it's also more expensive. It takes more time to load as well, but this option seems to be the favorite for winter camping expeditions where distance is a factor. With the freight toboggan, I like to bring a small utility sled for ice fishing and day trips. I tow it behind and haul in some bulky items on it, but only things that don't weigh much since it doesn't glide as well, mostly stuff for my sleep system like sleeping bag. Heavy items are better off on the toboggan because it produces less friction. Between these three options, a Pulk is great for getting through the woods or the bush because it's maneuverable. A Smitty sled or freight toboggan is less nimble, but they excel on flat, open terrain like a trail or a frozen lake. Pulks are also the easiest to pack and get in and out of the house and car, but hauling a heavy load on a Pulk is tough. There's no right answer, it just depends on how you're using it and what you want to spend. So you've been hauling in for a while and you're looking around for a spot to set up. Hot tenting can be a high impact way to camp in the backcountry, so don't camp on summer sites unless you're required to or you're bringing in your own firewood. The fuel demands of hot tenting will deplete the firewood supply on the campsite. Camp in a random spot like this, ideally where no one is likely to camp or even set foot on again anytime soon. And really this isn't even a sacrifice. Winter creates infinite new campsites, so take advantage of that. There are three things I look for in site selection. 1. Somewhere relatively flat and dry. If you have lots of snow, you can use it to level the tent pad, but it's best to start out as flat as possible. Also, you might be surprised how wet it can be beneath deep snow, so avoid low-lying areas and don't assume everything is frozen solid. Item number 2 is access to water, and I'll get into the ways of getting water later. Snow does the trick, but it's my last choice. The third one will save you a ton of time. Set up where you can see standing dead trees for firewood. Sometimes you set up on a spot that looks really good, but then you can hardly find a stick to burn. Do yourself a favor and have a look around. We'll talk more about firewood later in a bit. So you found your spot and it's time to set up. First, level it out with snow if needed. A small shovel is great to have, but don't get a cheap one because they won't last in the cold. This one is all metal with no plastic. Plastic is more prone to snapping in extreme cold. A shovel is great for leveling out the tent pad, burning the skirt of the tent, removing embers from a hot stove, and to have in your car. Parking can be a challenge in winter, so I always come prepared to shovel out my own spot, including a bigger shovel, which I leave in the car. The most common hot tents I see here in Ontario are either pyramid style with a center pole, or like this one with an internal frame. Center pole hot tents are usually less expensive, but harder to get them set up taut, and the center pole obstructs the floor space. They certainly do the job though. The internal frame models make setup easy and open up the floor space, but they're costly, you have the added weight of the frame, and if the frame breaks on a trip, you'll have to improvise. I prefer cotton canvas over synthetic hot tents primarily because they breathe and allow moisture to escape, and sunlight just looks magical coming through the canvas. I also just don't like the idea of synthetic fabrics around the hot stove, but that's just me. Obviously lots of people get away with it. On the other hand, synthetic hot tents can be much lighter and cheaper. The bigger the tent is, the harder it is to set up, especially solo, the harder it is to heat, and of course the heavier it will be to haul. So it's important to choose a size that's appropriate for your use, not just the roomiest one. This one is 8 by 10 feet, and my pyramid style is 11 by 11. That's about 50% more square footage in the pyramid tent, but because of the center pole, I find it still only sleeps 2 comfortably. I've had 3 and even 4 people in it, and it's tight quarters. I went with the 8x10 for this tent because I'm mostly solo, sometimes a pair. Once the tent is upright, we need to stake out the guy lines. However, if the ground is frozen or if you have to dig through 3 feet of snow, there are better options than stakes. I don't even bring any. First, I try to position the tent so I can guy out to trees. Otherwise, I use snow anchors. Just grab a stick 1 to 2 feet long, tie the guy line around it, place it, and pack snow around it. Push down so you hear that crunch and allow the snow to sinter for at least a few minutes before tensioning the line. The longer the better, and this will eventually become rock solid. This particular tent also has some pickets to keep the sidewalls upright. Some people bring a floor for their tent. I don't. An insulated floor is heavy, and foam tiles are bulky. You can simply use a ground sheet or a tarp, but then you have to watch out for sparks or melted snow pooling on it, and they provide no insulation. You might use spruce boughs, but consider where you are and your impact on that site. Whatever you lay down, always be mindful of putting things near the stove. A tent fire in the middle of the night at 30 below is a scary thought, to say the least. Next, we'll bury the edges in snow to keep drafts out. Often the tent will have a synthetic skirt which sheds snow and ice more easily when it's time to pack up. Take a moment to admire your beautiful little home. We can start moving in by setting up the stove, but not too close to the tent or it'll make the canvas brittle or even melt a synthetic tent. So let's get into stoves. This is an 18-inch long titanium stove, and I also have a 24-inch stainless steel stove for my larger tent. The stove should be proportional to the tent size, but a longer stove means less time spent sawing firewood because you can cut it to the length of the stove. This titanium pipe doesn't weigh much, but I like to have some kind of support for an angled stovepipe like a bipod or a tripod, especially in windy conditions. You can see I was trying something here with some hardware store items, but honestly I'd rather find some dead branches. Be sure to consider the wind direction when angling your pipe. A stiff wind blowing down your pipe will smoke you out fast. I don't use a spark arrestor because my pipe comes out in an angle, so I'm not that worried about it, plus they inhibit draw and tend to get caked up with creosote. I do like an elbow on the end for angling the exhaust with the wind, especially if the wind is changing direction throughout your trip, and the elbow can be used to shelter the pipe from rain and snow. Some stoves come with a thin roll-up stack. Personally, I wouldn't touch those with a 10-foot stovepipe, especially not in extreme cold. They're quite fragile and finicky. My stoves have holes to put sticks through the legs for flotation, so the stove doesn't sink down as much in deep snow, and you can see the rest of my hardware store experiment here with these thresholds. Again, I prefer a couple of sticks, but if you're camping somewhere like a campground where you can't take sticks, something like this would do. A heat shield like this beneath the stove will inhibit melt and help keep the stove where it is. You can get a metal sheet known as a false bottom to protect the bottom of the stove from excess heat, and this goes inside of the stove. After you start your fire and build up a layer of ash on the bottom, that'll also help protect the bottom of the stove, so a false bottom isn't strictly necessary. A side table is a must for me. It provides much more space when cooking, and you can keep food and water warm there. This stove uses a sliding plate for a flue damper rather than the traditional circular plate that rotates on a pin with springs. This flue damper and the one on the door control airflow through your stove, and they're critical to managing stove temperature and burn time. I like a baffle in my stove, which is the metal shelf at the back that the flames are licking around. It keeps heat in the stove longer so I get the most of my hard-earned firewood. Oven gloves are extremely useful with a wood stove for things like cooking and handling the dampers when they're hot. A magnetic thermometer like this is terrific for monitoring your burn. The magnet won't stick to titanium or stainless steel, but it does stick to these galvanized steel elbows that you find at a hardware store. It's supposed to be a bit higher up the pipe, but this does the trick. If the fire isn't burning hot enough, this will create creosote buildup in your stack. Poor quality wood will also produce more creosote. Be sure to clean out your pipes as needed when the stove isn't in use. With respect to rust, water and ash will contribute to corrosion. Stainless steel or titanium stoves will minimize corrosion, but are more expensive, so pick your poison. I brush out and oil my stoves before putting them away for the summer. Lastly, I bring a battery-powered carbon monoxide alarm. I'm told this needs to be kept well off the ground to work properly, and this one's minimum operating temperature is 4 degrees Celsius. To me, even if it's unlikely, it's not worth the risk of going without one. So by this point in the day, your water might be getting low. You may have sweat a lot hauling in and setting up, and the cold can really dry you out. Get ahead of this and get water right away if you need to. In hot temps, we crave water, but it can be so easy to neglect in the cold. I try to haul in enough water, about 2 liters, so that I don't need to get more until my stove is going. Then I can boil and purify the water I get from camp. There are a few options for water sources. Snow is the most obvious, but it's my last choice. Snow is not dense even when packed in, and you need a lot of snow to get a good amount of water. It's about a 10-to-1 ratio of snow to melted water. It also tends to be full of debris unless there's been a lot of very fresh snow. Here, it was my only choice, not a big deal though. I put some water in each container to buffer the heat of the stove. Melted snow can taste weird without doing this. I typically bring an auger for ice fishing, so if I'm on a lake I would much rather use that. After using the auger, I bury the hole in snow to insulate it and it'll stay open even in very cold temperatures. You can also use an ice chisel on the lake, however if there's 3 feet of ice you better hope you hit a layer of slush or you'll be at it for a long time. But the ideal scenario for water is to camp within range of a little creek that's still flowing. Sometimes you won't see it, but you'll hear it running under the snow. It still needs to be boiled, but it's very convenient. Okay, after all that, we still need to do our firewood prep. Here I found myself doing this in the dark after plan A and plan B for this trip didn't work out and my day got long. There's a lot of work to do for one person and not much daylight to do it. Early in the winter camping season, when things aren't completely frozen, getting around can be tough, so it's good to have some backup options for your trip. So first of all with firewood, never cut live trees. This is illegal unless you have a permit on public land or permission on private land. This seems to be forgotten sometimes and you'll see it on social media pretty often. Or worse, you'll see a bushcraft shelter with obviously green wood in places like Algonquin Park. Completely illegal and it's just plain selfish. And as far as firewood goes, live trees are terrible anyway, so leave them be. If you're not sure if a tree is dead, especially deciduous trees that drop their leaves, again, just leave it alone, find something else. Keep in mind that that tree is probably older than you. My preference is a standing dead tree with the top still on. If the top of the tree is broken off, there's a higher chance the fiber is going to be rotten or degraded. A downed tree is less likely to be in good condition, but it's worth sinking your saw into one to check before felling a new one. Taking down a large tree can be really dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Once I pick out a tree, I look for the tree's natural lean and make sure the area is clear if I need to move away quickly. Then I cut a wedge on the side where I want the tree to fall, and then make a cut on the other side of the tree higher than the wedge. That's a high level description, but there are lots of good videos on how to do this safely, and I'll defer to them. It was getting late, so I cut just enough for the evening, but here's some more footage from the following day. Cut rounds to the length of the stove minus a little bit to give some room to position the wood in the stove. If I cut only 2/3 of the length of the stove, I'm going to spend 50% more time sawing the same amount of fuel. The top of my saw is a perfect guideline for the 18-inch stove I have here, so I measure quickly with that. Once the tree is on the ground, I like to prop it up with another log to elevate it and prevent binding. If the log is moving around a lot while I saw, that means I'm wasting energy moving the log instead of cutting it, so I try to keep it still. As for tools, I use a folding 24-inch bow saw for bucking up logs and bring a smaller folding saw that fits in a large pocket, but I only use this for light trail clearing and smaller jobs. I have a splitting axe for what you'd expect, and a hatchet for limbing and making fine splits. Here in the boreal forest, I'm almost always burning softwood. Most commonly spruce, sometimes balsam fir, but best of all jack pine if I can find it because it offers more BTUs. Hardwoods generally offer even more BTUs, but I don't get that option up here. I don't waste my time even thinking about birch anymore. If cut and seasoned, it's great firewood, but it doesn't work that way in the bush. Its bark seals in moisture and it just rots. Trembling aspen, broadly referred to as poplar, is common here, but rots fairly quickly as well, so I rarely bother even trying it. The nice thing about softwood is it's easier to process. Hardwoods like oak or maple are more work to saw, however their denser fiber is useful for maintaining a long burn. Pros and cons, like there is with almost every camping topic. At negative 20 degrees Celsius or colder, I don't like to cold camp, so I'll run the stove all night. But with softwoods, I have to wake up every 90 minutes to keep the temperature reasonable. Watch out for tamarack. They're coniferous, meaning they produce cones, but deciduous, so they drop their needles in the fall, unlike spruce, pine, and fir, or SPF as they're known in forestry, which keep their needles year-round. In winter, a tamarack may look like a dead spruce, but in fact be very alive, so it's important to be able to identify it. Look for buds on the branches, and to me, it kinda looks like wispy hair. Tamarack is also a very tough wood and difficult to saw and split, so I would steer clear. It does burn hot, and I've heard it can actually damage relatively thin gauge portable wood stoves like these. Once we've bucked up the log, it's time to split the rounds. With this style of camping, we're rarely going to have a nice big splitting block. Instead, I like to find a dead log that's lying on the ground and split against it, not on top of it. I can easily split from my knees like this, which is safer, and I find it easier as well. You don't have to bend over repetitively to place the wood since you're already low to the ground, and you don't waste time trying to balance logs upright. I also find my aim to be much more precise like this. I like to make a mix of halves, quarters, and fine splits, and keeping some full rounds can be useful too if they'll fit in your stove. These rounds can maintain a burn longer, but deliver heat more slowly. I wouldn't put a full round in until I have a solid coal bed, and I certainly wouldn't start my fire with them. With firewood processed, it's finally time to light the stove and feel that warmth. Be sure that the stove legs and pipe are secure. If they collapse with the stove roaring, it's a dangerous situation. To load the stove for lighting, I like to lay splits on the bottom, some fine splits on top, and some birch bark nestled in around the top. That's it, and don't cram it full. Open the flue damper so smoke can escape, and then light the fuse and let the finer stuff burn down into the splits. This may seem counterintuitive to an open fire, but if I try to make a small fire and then put big stuff on top, it's going to smother it and stifle the draw. The fine splits are best for starting the stove rather than twigs, which tend to be icy and moist, and they should take the flame easily from the tinder. Add pieces as needed, but nothing too big until it's going strong. From here, we control the burn based on how much fuel we put in the stove, and more importantly, how we use the dampers. I like to picture the dampers like dams holding back water. The door damper controls how much water, or in this case air, you let in, and the flue damper controls how quickly you let it out, and how quickly you let out your heat. Use them in tandem and study how they affect your burn. The stovepipe thermometer is fantastic for learning how to get an optimal burn. You can often just feel it in the air if it's too hot or too cold, but if your stove is glowing hot, reduce the airflow immediately. We'll get water boiling right away, enjoy the warmth and a well-deserved hot meal on the stove, and then it's time to get our sleep system laid out. Inflatable pads can provide a lot of insulation with high R values, but it's really important to have more than that in case your pad fails. If you wake up and it's minus 30 degrees Celsius and your pad has gone flat with a slow leak, finding a pinhole leak can be a lot harder in the bush than at home, and repairing it can be a challenge too if your repair adhesives aren't bonding properly because of the cold temperatures. I use a run-of-the-mill closed cell foam mat, a sheet of Reflectix or R foil from a hardware store, and an inflatable pad with an R value of 5. The cold ground will leach heat out of you fast if there's not enough insulation beneath you. This is a minus 20 degrees Celsius down sleeping bag, but if you don't have a winter bag, you could double up 3 season bags. Overnight, you may get moisture condensing on the outside of your sleeping bag and turning to frost where your body heat and the cold ambient air meet. Try a synthetic overbag to ensure your down bag doesn't get wet. I like to hang my sleeping bag when I have the stove going to keep it as dry as possible. I love bringing a hot water bottle to warm up the sleeping bag, but make sure it's sealed tight first. I find the heat of the boiled water can cause the lid to loosen up a bit after a few minutes. A Cosy made of that Reflectix material will help insulate the water bottle if you want to save that heat for later in the night. I also like to fill a thermos so I wake up with hot water for coffee or for a fresh hot water bottle in the middle of the night. Some people use a cot and they do make some packable ones, but the large ones aren't an option for me and it's simply something I can do without. If you take every luxury, however small they may seem, it will add up to an unmanageable load, especially solo. What you consider important enough to bring is up to you. Sometimes I build a little headboard of snow or use some gear to prop up my back so I can sit up and read. You'll definitely want somewhere to sit while you cook on the stove. Some use milk crates, but our favorite option is a pail. Pails are cheap, easy to find, and they nest. You can carry a load of snow or water in them if needed, or even use one as a makeshift shovel. You can also buy foam or padded seats that attach to 19-liter pails, and they're a good place to store odds and ends too. We put a canoe seat on top for padding and back support, and I prefer these to collapsible chairs because they're much harder to break, don't sink into the snow as much as chair legs, and you can sit on them almost anywhere. One of the best things about a hot tent is getting to dry out your wet gear. It's key to have a good spot to hang base layers, boot liners, and mitts to dry, either on your center pole in a pyramid tent or with a line tied across your internal frame. The stove gets the top of the tent much hotter than the floor, so high up is the best place to dry things out. Now that all those jobs are done, congratulations, you get to go to sleep. You'll likely be exhausted. I know I always am on a camp setup day. There are so many other topics we could go into, but those are the fundamentals of hot tenting. I hope it helped if you're new to this, and if you're experienced, hopefully you got some ideas for your own setup. One last thing. The idea of a camping trip in wilderness is scary to some, but the most dangerous part is probably the drive there, and this is even more true in winter. I saw this truck in the ditch on the way to this trip, and it brought back memories of when Aaron went through this same experience a few years ago. On a similar note, never dive into extreme cold with gear you haven't tested. Work your way toward colder and colder temps, but start out slow and have an emergency exit like your car nearby. If traveling over water, breaking through the ice can be deadly. Wear picks to help you claw out if needed, and if you're in a group, it can be a good idea to bring throw ropes for rescue. In general, know your limit and play within it. As you learn to do it safely, doors will open up and you'll discover the beauty of a season that many campers shun. And because of this, winter camping can mean a new level of peace and quiet that some people may have never experienced. As your confidence grows and you build your winter kit, you might even find a part of yourself looking forward to winter, and that is a far better feeling than dreading a big chunk of the year. I could keep trying to convince you, but I think you'll agree that this scene speaks for itself.